There we go. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our discussion theory series on digital threats to democracy, put on by the League of Women Voters of Maine in partnership with the League of Women Voters of Alaska. It's great to see people from all over joining us. And if you've been to any of these discussions before, you know they're pretty casual, but often our speakers have a wealth of information about these topics. So feel free to put any questions that you have or that you come up with while we're chatting. Feel free to put those into the chat and I'll start reading them out later. And we'll see how many we can get to in the hour. But my name's Lane, and I work for the League of Women Voters of Maine, and I'm going to be facilitating this conversation. And our guest tonight is Dr. Danielle Allen. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Allen is a James Bryant Conant University professor and director of the Edmond and Lily Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard. She's also a professor of political philosophy, ethics, and public policy. She's also a seasoned nonprofit leader, democracy advocate, national voice on pandemic response, distinguished author, and mom. And we invited Dr. Allen on today because she recently wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post. Hopefully some of you have had a chance to read it as well. But it is about the potential threats of AI to democracy. So that's what we're going to chat about today. Thank you for being here, Dr. Allen.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Lane. So let me go ahead and just introduce myself a little bit more, and then let me share some framing thoughts for what is a big, complicated, and super important topic. And I will be really interested in your questions and glad to talk about these themes in whatever direction is most interesting to you. So yes, thank you, Lane, for that generous introduction. When people ask me to boil it down and ask me to say what I work on, I always give the same answer, which is just democracy, past, present, and future thereof, and no question mark on the end of that for me. I come by that focusing commitment. Super honestly, it's a matter of basic family inheritance. My granddad on my dad's side helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida in the 1940s. And that was super dangerous work. Lynchings were on the rise at the time. So just for sort of a sense of perspective about danger and difficulty. On my mom's side, my great-grandparents helped fight for women's right to vote. And my great-grandmother ended up as president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 1930s. So we're all historians in my family, so I still have her sort of pocket-sized rules of order, Mrs. Emma Fox's Don'ts for Presiding Officers, it was called. And, that's what she used for running league meetings in the 30s. So I was really fortunate to grow up in a universe of super civically engaged people. And my family were people who were engaged all across the political spectrum. So there was this one crazy year in my youth, 1992, when my aunt was on the ballot in the Bay Area in California for Congress for the Peace and Freedom Party on the far left side of the spectrum. And the very same year, my dad was running for Senate from Southern California as a Reagan Republican. So we used to have incredible family dinner table conversations, and they would just really go at it. My dad was like super skinny, he was a professor. There was always sort of pipe smoke curling around his head. My aunt was a really big woman, sort of built like a Mack truck. She had a big belly laugh, and she was gay, and they would just go at it sort of hammer and tongs. And as a kid watching them, I sort of, trying to figure it all out, I came to see that they actually shared the goal. They had the same thing they were after. They were both after empowerment for themselves, for their families, for their communities. And then they were having this like massive debate about the how to get there. So my dad was arguing for market liberties and civic virtues. My aunt was arguing for public sector investment across all segments of society and experiments in living. And then the second thing I recognized watching them was that in addition to agreeing on what they were after, the sort of project of empowerment, there was another thing that was also true about them, which was that it was also clear that they never broke the bond of love that they had for one another. So for all of their disagreement, they sort of held sacred the human being in front of them. It was clear that they always had each other's back. So that was my sort of like lesson in democracy, my sense of the definition of democracy, that it's this shared project of self-government for free and equal citizens, a project of empowerment. We can debate like crazy exactly how we might get there, and none of us are going to get exactly what we want out of the end of this sort of pipeline of the process. But as we do this, we have to always hold sacred the dignity of the other human being in front of us. So I will say I kind of took that kind of concept of democracy for granted as a young person, took for granted the value of democracy. And it wasn't until I was coming up, my own generation was coming up, that the question of democracy became much more pointed and complicated for me. So my parents' generation all kind of moved up in the world. My granddad was a fisherman. His kids were small business owners and professors. On the other side, was sort of from factory workers to accountants and the like. But my generation, I'm just over 50, my generation has lived through what I call the great pulling apart. So over the course of my lifetime, there's just sort of been this spread like this. So I sit, here with you tonight, the pleasure of being a tenured faculty member at Harvard, which is one of the most privileged roles, in the universe from my point of view. Forget Jeff Bezos, if you're sort of thinking about freedom and security, it's just extraordinary. And I recognize and feel that privilege every day. I have a brother who's a corporate executive, but I also have cousins who aren't with us anymore, and not for reasons I can feel at peace about. So substance use disorder, homicide, things like that. And so what my family has experienced, the sort of pulling apart, is also actually what the country has experienced. It's perfectly parallel in my lifetime: the rise of income inequality, the rise of wealth inequality, the rise of incarceration, and the rise of polarization. So I hit a point in 2009, I lost my youngest cousin, Michael. And that led me to sort of ask this question about democracy, because it's not just supposed to be abstractly good. It's supposed to be good because it's actually helping whole generational cohorts move up together. So I began to ask this question of, well, what could we do to change the dynamics in our country so that our democracy is once again permitting us to pull together and pull everybody forward together? So I've been working on democracy renovation consistently since that time. And I say all that as prelude because to talk about AI is to say that, if the period from 1970 to sort of, 1920 was the sort of period of the great pulling apart, what really started in 2004, 2005 was another thing, the age of AI being layered on top of all of that. And so all of the challenges of the great pulling apart, the, again, rise of income inequality, rise of wealth inequality, polarization, and so forth, we now have an exacerbator that could make all that stuff a lot worse. Or if we think proactively and creatively, we could find ways to tap into new technologies that are sort of resources for addressing some of the challenges that have emerged in our democracy. So let me turn to the subject at hand, the sort of question of AI and how it fits in to the picture I've just sketched about the health of our democracy and the challenges that are in front of us. And let me say something first about social media, which won't exactly be a point about AI, but it'll help sort of, I think, frame the conversation. And then I'll say some things about AI specifically and the new challenges that we have as of literally the last 6 months. And then we'll be just really grateful to open up for a conversation and to hear what's on your mind. But so here's the thing about social media. So we have all registered the toxicity of our information environment, how people treat each other, the proliferation of bullying, the spread of misinformation and disinformation, and how hard it is. Like even for, here at League of Women Voters is the heart of the culture of educating ourselves for political participation, right? And I'm sure even for you, the high degree of being informed and educated about our political process, you find it hard to sort out the information that sort of swirls around you. I find it hard to sort out and sort of sit here as a person with, 2 PhDs and teaching at Harvard. So it just is really hard. And we feel intuitively some kind of connection between the changes social media have brought and the vulnerabilities and fragilities of our democracies, which are now so very clear to us. So I wanted to sort of say out loud exactly why social media has had such a powerful impact on the kind of basic building blocks of our system. And it really comes down to this. So when the Constitution was designed, it was designed at a point also of great tribalism and factionalism and paralysis. Congress couldn't get a quorum. They couldn't pay their war debts. People were, at each other's throats, literally. And so the design of the Constitution was supposed to solve for the problem of faction, as they called it in the 18th century vocabulary of the day. And James Madison explains in the Federalist Papers, the essays that he published as op-eds defending the Constitution, how this design was supposed to solve the problem of faction. He offers this explanation in the 10th essay, Federalist 10, as we often call it. And the thing about this essay is we often teach it, but when we teach it, we only teach half of the solution that he described. The half that we teach of the two-pronged solution is that, well, it was a representative democracy that had been set up. So the point was it wasn't going to be direct democracy. You wouldn't have everybody just sort of showing up in the huge assembly and voting on anything and everything. Decisions would flow through representatives, distinguished people in principle, right, selected to help synthesize a kind of a good steering direction for the country. But that's only half of the solution. So the other half, which we have forgotten to teach for decades, was that it was representation in a broad republic. That's Madison's phrase, a broad republic. And by that, he literally meant the geographic breadth of the country and the geographic dispersal of the population. The argument he makes is that it will be hard for people with extreme views to find one another because they'll literally be spread out geographically. So think about the role of mountains and rivers and the like. So you can see where this is going. Social media, in other words, exploded one of the premises of the design. The idea was that because people were dispersed, even with people with extreme views, would have to go through the representatives to get their views into the public sphere. And so the representatives would be a brake on any of the really crazy stuff that was happening. Here we are in a world with no brakes left, right? Because anybody anywhere can find anybody else. And there's lots of good that comes of that. Alaska and Maine, you can come together and co-host a terrific and important event. But people with extreme views can also now find each other and put their voices in the public sphere. So in other words, one of the pillars for how representation was supposed to function has been knocked out from under us. So that's social media, just all by itself without what we now have, generative foundation models and large language models for AI. So the challenge is that the new technologies have introduced new capabilities that are highly unpredictable and that do have the capacity to have similar sort of structural level impacts on our political system. So in the first instance, there's a real problem of just even how much easier it will be to produce misinformation and disinformation and how much faster it can travel and how much more carefully or kind of cleverly people can manipulate other people or just plain set up bots to sort of work on habits and practices of manipulation. So the sense that we kind of don't know what's happening in the public sphere, don't know who's speaking, don't know who's communicating, don't know where a message really comes from, it's about to get a lot worse, basically. And that's scary and challenging because we already sort of feel what happens when our kind of ability to trust our information ecosystem sort of starts to erode beneath us. So that's a really big thing. There are other kinds of challenges in the sense that, so what has happened, the sort of phase change that people are sort of spending so much time talking about is that, so people have obviously been training AI models on data sets for quite some time. And you've probably all sort of heard about the challenges of how if a data set or if a model ingests data full of biases, it will spit out answers that are full of biases, right? So for example, if you are trying to use an AI model to assist you in sentencing in the judicial context or bail decisions, that's a better example, and you want to know the probability that this person in front of the judge is going to do something again while they're out on bail, and you're using an AI model to give you an answer to that, the AI model will spit out answers that show racial disparities because the data that it's pulling in are data that also show racial disparities, and you'll get racially disparate decisions in your bail outcomes there. So that's sort of the problem that we were used to. And that was sort of a problem that came at a point when data models were being trained on, you could almost sort of say, human-sized data sets. So data sets that any one of us might have imagined working with in many of our kind of professional occupations. If you're an economist and you have whole suites of economic data from across the country, it's sort of human-sized. But what they have developed the capacity to do is to train the models on quantities of data that are sort of unimaginable to the human mind. So it's just sort of the vastness of the scale. What the vastness of the scale means is that the models themselves can start to see patterns and find patterns in the data that are not even kind of imaginable to us. Like we wouldn't even know to look for those patterns because we don't know what it means to look at things from a sort of scale of possessing that much data and information. I like to kind of analogize it to sort of like having God's eye view, right? Like if you could actually know all data points in the world, you would be able to see stuff that like ordinary human beings just can't see. And then you'd be able to like think stuff that ordinary human beings can't think. And that's roughly speaking, what is now possible with the new AI models. So one of the biggest challenges is not just that they have a lot of capability for manipulation, if somebody wanted to put them to use that way, or that they can accelerate the production of fraud and misinformation, but also just the fact that like they're literally unpredictable for us right now. Like we literally don't actually know what their capabilities are. And so that then is sort of the challenge of having a kind of an additional agent in the world, so to speak. You've got lions and tigers and bears and AI bots, okay? And we kind of know what lions and tigers and bears do. And we know that if they're inside a city, they've got to be in a zoo and you've got to have them on a leash and so forth. And if they're in the wild, then that's okay. And, but we don't really know how AI bots ultimately can fully function. And so that's where the sort of governance challenge comes in. And then added to that as well, so it's certainly in the case that they can accelerate weapons production, invention of new forms of toxins and biopathogens, all these kinds of things. So there's sort of the hard challenge of, in the hands of the wrong actor, what does this capacity or capability really mean or look for? So at any rate, that's the sort of challenge. There are also opportunities. Let me just sort of spell out like two opportunities to talk about. One in the space of education. It is definitely the case that the new models have the capacity to help any individual learner figure out like what thing they specifically need next, like which particular experience, lesson, activity, piece of information would most help this learner, given where they are, actually take their learning to the next level. So we have the prospect in front of us of genuinely personalized learning. So imagine we're all used to kind of classrooms, rows of seats, all the kids marching through the same lesson. You can imagine a world instead where in any given classroom, what the kids are actually doing is following a learning journey that will maximize their own ability to develop their potential. That's huge, right? That's really opportunity creating and a thing to be really, really excited about. Another thing to be really excited about is there's been some great work with this in Taiwan. There are actually ways in which we can solve some of our political problems together using AI. So for example, if you have a huge community of people, take the population of Taiwan as an example for starters, where they've done this, and you're having a kind of public debate about a polarized issue, you can build, a sort of innovative approach to sort of surveying opinion that surfaces the places where people actually have points of common agreement that they're not seeing in the public conversation. And then lo and behold, you can get some new policy solutions and actually find your way to a compromise. So there's a tool in Taiwan called Polis that has been using AI to support this kind of compromise finding and problem solving. So a lot will come down to how we choose to govern these new capabilities, and whether we choose to invest in those kinds of uses that will bring us the benefits, and whether we can figure out how to sort of control the part that is susceptible to adversarial usage. So let me stop there. I know that was a lot, and I'm happy to talk about, any piece or part of it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great framing of the scope of sort of everything, I think, without getting too into. I personally am always finding ways to get into the weeds of the technology itself. And I really like that you were talking about things like how we govern the technology and how it represents a disruptive factor to democracy that must be regulated and can be used for good or bad, and sort of the ways that we might use technology. I see we already have some questions here. We'll try to get to as many as we can. But I wanted to start actually with this question from Penelope in the chat, which is, what scares you the most about 2024 elections? And I want to sort of frame that in like, in terms of AI and this new, you said sort of 6 months, we've sort of experienced a new phase. And I think you're referencing the chat GPT when it came out last November or December. And I really have seen other people use that as a marker of this new era of AI, of like general intelligence AI or generative, large language model AI. So sort of thinking that we haven't experienced a national election with AI, and we have one that is very consequential coming up in not very long. In that sense, what threats might there be to democracy and to that election that you are sort of scared of?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So just for the sake of the record, for this, so I would sort of date the sea change to the March release of GPT-4, Chat GPT-4, which was a sort of phase shift in capability. So for whatever that's worth, that's really in the weeds inside
No,
debate.
thanks.
But at any rate, so I mean, I think we're already seeing some of the challenges, right? Various AI generated images and ads, which can put candidates, for example, in what look like very damning situations with just hyper realism to them. So, we have been working for some time to equip ourselves, again, to sort of sort through misinformation and disinformation, but we're all going to have to sort of take it to another level, basically. And I think the hard question is, what you ask, what scares me most would be sort of a lack of upfront understanding of who's most likely to be susceptible to techniques of this kind and with what kind of implications. So I don't think, that we're all about to be kind of bamboozled or something like that by AI. But I do imagine there will be sort of differential patterns of impact in terms of people getting really sucked into conspiracy theories and things like that. And, what does it mean to have that conspiracy theory mode of being be worsened for that election? That is a concern.
Thanks. Yeah, that's interesting. We have another question here, and I think you sort of mentioned it briefly in your op-ed. This person, Lori, asks, can the plug be pulled, i.e. the power source, in case of emergency? And I know you used the phrase, I think, compute governance in your op-ed. Do you want to just talk about that a little bit? Is that a realistic option or scenario?
Yeah, no, great. That's a great question, Lane. So compute is the word that names the power needed to do the training of these AI models. It takes just massive quantities of power, enough power that you can see the work. You can see from space when the power is being sort of invested in work of this kind. So you can think about the power involved in training frontier AI models. And so I'm going to introduce that phrase, frontier AI, because you really want to distinguish between stuff that is at that frontier, which is using this sort of massive quantities of data, which, for example, Microsoft invested about $4 billion in generating Chat GPT-4. And like that $4 billion is like mostly paying for compute. Okay, so just to kind of give you a sense of things, like 60 people who work for OpenAI, and then like $4 billion of compute. And so, yes, so you can think of it in some senses like uranium in the context of nuclear power, a kind of source that is necessary to create these models and then the tools that are built on them. And so in principle, for frontier AI, the stuff that's really at the kind of cutting edge, you could govern that. One of the challenges of this space is that once the sort of frontier stuff is created, if it's released broadly, then it's very easy for other people to kind of harvest its capability. They don't have to recreate all that work. So they don't need the same amount of compute to create tools based on the models that have been created. So in that regard, compute really only gives us a way of kind of governing frontier stuff. It doesn't really give us a way of governing, all the apps that will be created in open access ways based on the models that already exist. So that's one of the challenges.
Yeah, that's a really helpful distinction. And in terms of sort of open access or open source, I think we're already seeing that to some extent, but I don't know much about this sort of field, so maybe you could share, like, is OpenAI and other companies that are doing the frontier AI work, are they offering some of their code or their source sort of to the public for that sort of use?
So OpenAI has not made its stuff open access, but Meta, formerly known as Facebook, did. This is a point of great controversy, actually, because so what they have made open and available is already spread around the world and is generating all kinds of further things. And I do think ultimately, like, a governance framework will include federal regulation, like FDA style. So FDA has to approve new drugs. And similarly, I think for the folks working at the sort of frontier AI level, we do actually need to designate a federal agency. My recommendation is Homeland Security, actually, which might sound a little weird, but we could talk about that. Possibly Department of Energy as the entity that has to establish hazard levels for different kinds of model training that you would do. And then for those in the highest hazard categories, they would be required to move through a regulatory process before being released. So I do think that is part of where we are likely to be heading from a governance and regulatory point of view.
Interesting.
So, which would make, if that had existed, would make Meta sort of in violation of something like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was just sort of thinking, and again, my tech knowledge is limited, but that if the more that is open access, the more good and bad actors could use it and sculpt it into what they want, and the harder it would be to regulate after the fact.
Exactly. And so that's where there's a trade-off, right? Because it's the good actor, bad actor trade-off. The fact that anybody in a garage, so to speak, right, can harvest from those models once they've been released and sort of use them to, say, build businesses, build creative enterprises and the like, is also, democratizing, empowering, enabling. So that's the tricky thing, is you want to figure out how to make sure we can actually draw on the technology to spread opportunity. You don't want to just sort of close it off. The tech companies, as we know, have massive amounts of power, nearly monopolistic control in a variety of ways. And if you get the kind of regulatory balance wrong, you also exacerbate that. And so that's where the kind of real kind of tricky set of questions comes in. So
Yeah, that's a really interesting tension. So we're sort of getting towards a question here in the chat from Mary Lee, which is that Chuck Schumer says Congress is going to have a major push for AI legislation. We've seen that in the news as well. And what kind of laws would you advocate? You already talked about this idea of FDA style regulation and having a regulatory agency named, but are there other things that you would sort of personally advocate for?
yeah, I mean, there's sort of further detail to that in particular. So, so there's the stuff that we should be asking or requiring firms to do internally themselves. And then there's the sort of independent evaluation that we want an agency to have the capacity to do. In order for an agency to have the capacity to do independent evaluation of the sort of training process and pre-deployment decision-making and then monitoring of deployment, that agency would need massive amounts of compute. So there would be a need for public sector investment in public sector compute, so that it is not only the private sector that has the capacity to keep up here. So that's another sort of tricky issue. Again, the balance of power between technology companies and the public sector right now is really in the favor of the technology companies. And so we would need to do that. And then there's this other sort of complicated thing, which is about how do you pay attention not just to the models themselves and the capabilities they have and whether or not they're sort of following their instructions or going off the rails. But then there's also the question of what impacts do they have on our different social domains? So, on mental health, for example, on the job market and labor, on how democracy operates. And so to some extent, in addition to just a sort of an agency with kind of designated responsibility for the highest hazard tiers and frontier AI, we're probably going to need like literally every federal agency to have new kinds of capacity to be monitoring the deployments of AI within that sector. So health and human services, for example, labor, Department of Education. So what that all sums up to, when you say all that stuff out loud, is a massive actually need for human capital, for a kind of talent pipeline, and investing in making sure that people with technical capacity are ready to serve in the public sector. That's also a big mindset shift for us as a country, right? Where all these young people go off to like Google and Facebook and other tech companies and think about startups and making their billions or whatever not. And somehow we have to redirect, generation really of young people to be ready for public service.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about policy solutions and other types of solutions. But I also was interested. There's a question that just came in about what about copyright, intellectual property, privacy, information. Sorry, my cat is mad at me. That are being plundered to build this AI. Is there any chance of compensation? So I'm also curious about that, that they were able to, use all of this content that we have collectively generated on the internet as data to create these models, but I'm not getting like a check for any of the content that I personally produced for that effort. So I don't know if you have anything to say on that.
I think it's a hugely important point. I mean, so it is exactly that. Like we've all been creating labor we've all labored for the last 25 years, creating digital data. And the companies are harvesting the fruits of our labor. And there are people who have been working to develop policy models for recognizing data as labor, data cooperatives and things like that. I think one of the things that we're likely to see over time is that our kind of basic protocols for how we handle our own digital footprints will change. And to some extent, there may be parts of what we do where compensation does come in, that data is recognized as labor. And we may all make different decisions, honestly, about what sort of data footprint we want to leave behind us. So I do think we will see changes on those fronts. And the copyright and intellectual property issues are really serious. And I don't think there are good answers to them yet.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting ongoing issue. But turning a little bit back towards these policy solutions, another question here about what happens when well-intentioned regulators become politicized and sort of are quote unquote bad regulations better than no regulations. And I'm curious also how you might answer that question in light of like how Congress or like the US regulated or failed to regulate social media too.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the question and the worries it expresses. I mean, I think at some level it's an impossible question, so I'm going to I'll slightly sort of go sideways. I mean, no regulations are just very, very bad. So regulations would have to be very, very bad, like very, very, very bad to be worse than no regulation, I guess. So I'm going to say that probably most regulations would be better than no regulations. And the odds of something so bad as to be worse than nothing are very low. But nonetheless, politicization, of course, matters. I do think the good news on that front is there are two pieces of good news. We're all trying to figure this stuff out. There's just so much learning to do. And so it's sort of way too early to be politicized. Like nobody knows enough to know how to politicize it yet. So we actually have a window of opportunity where we could try to get some good work done before political stakes become clearer and things are more easily politicized. The second piece of kind of paradoxical good news is that the folks in DC totally recognize this as a set of national security issues, as it does include. And I think, on the whole, we can get on national security, and the national security committees in particular tend to be a little bit better about trying to avoid the worst politicization in Congress. So I do think that's another sort of avenue of some hope. So I just wanted to somebody asked the question about pulling the plug. Could you sort of just pull the plug to stop things? And to some extent, one could. Although, again, that's where the fact of the goods that could come from this technology are a real counterbalance to that. But I also wanted to draw on that sort of reference to the grid and power and the like, just to actually make concrete another one of the big challenges. So much of our world now runs based on digital tools that's where another kind of real risk comes in. AI systems that if AI systems were to sort of escape human control or used by bad actors, they can just interact with other digital systems. And so much of our world depends on the stability of digital systems, that the notion that you would have a kind of unpredictable actor potentially interfering with digital systems is highly concerning. So yeah, it's sort of like Y2K on steroids, for those of you who remember how we all felt about Y2K. And it was fine in the end, we figured it out, right? So in that regard, we do have the capacity to figure this out, but it's a sort of similar kind of problem to that one too.
Yeah, something I hadn't thought about. Someone here in the chat is asking how you would evaluate EU regulation that are being put in place. I know there's sort of some new sort of regulatory proposals in the EU right now around AI. And this person also comments that they're way ahead of us on privacy regulation. So curious if you've sort of looked at some of the proposals in the EU and related to AI and what you might think of them.
There's a lot of good stuff in the EU examples. They are ahead of us. It is just the fact that we didn't regulate social media, right? And the EU did sort of start to dig in and figure out how to regulate around privacy in particular. And they've extended that. Their first round regulations around AI are much clearer about harms that might emerge, and regulatory structures from consumer protection to recognizable kind of anti-discrimination policies and the like, and sort of how they pertain. So we have a lot of lessons we can learn. Our challenge is also that it's the sort of the trade-off that people focus on is the trade-off between economic competitiveness, economic rewards and growth and productivity, and regulation. So that is what the debate will kind of turn around fundamentally. And in some sense, the stakes of that trade-off are higher for us than for Europe, because more of the companies that are generating the new economic possibilities are US-based companies. So when they regulate, it hurts our economy, and it doesn't hurt their economy as much.
Right. And if they were to implement some of these regulations, you're saying it hurts our economy. So I assume sort of there's an effect because those companies can't operate as extensively in Europe. But is there also an effect like a pulling back of any of the technology because it's too hard for companies to operate with different regulations in different markets? Like there was that conversation around social media when the EU was and England were sort of working on stricter regulations, and whether or not companies would just adopt those policies everywhere, or whether they would try to have different things in different places, if you know what I'm asking.
I do, yes. And so I was less concerned about the harm to the sort of specific firm. The firms themselves, Google, Microsoft, Meta, Amazon, and so forth, they are concerned about harm to themselves. And so they make the economic argument based on harm to themselves and increased costs of business. Any sort of firm is going to argue that increased costs of business are detrimental to the firm. So I think that's sort of where they tend to be. What I had in mind was something slightly different, which is just that, we've seen in this country over the last 50 years, just this incredible raft of innovation. And the innovation has spawned so many new businesses, right? And it's not just the big companies. There's all kinds of small businesses as well that have been able to build derivatively on the innovation that come out of the big companies. So the sort of economic concern is more about that. It's like slowing down innovation, slowing down, entrepreneurship, et cetera. And do we have good ways of quantifying that? I don't know them. They may exist, but that's sort of where the conversation is.
Right. So we have 15 minutes left. I want to encourage folks to keep throwing questions into the chat. And while people are doing that, I've been thinking, we've talked quite a bit about policy solutions. I think a lot of us on this call are interested in what that might look like and whether that feels realistic. So a question that I had is, given your concerns about the 2024 election and maybe some of the concerns that I or other people have on this call about the 2024 election, and maybe the role of AI in mis and disinformation, especially for people who might already be susceptible, as you sort of nuanced. Do you think that there's enough of an impetus for regulation that it would be implemented in time to have an effect on campaigns and the election itself in 2024? Or are we sort of looking at a slightly longer timeline here for US regulation?
That's a really good question. So I'm going to put in the chat a request for information from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So they're working on it. They're definitely, trying to figure out the policy framework. I think that a kind of AI strategy will be forthcoming from the White House sooner rather than later, like probably in the next 6 months. In terms of how quickly such a thing could translate into enforced regulation, I think most people do think the typical timetable would take longer than the 2024 election. Even in Europe, for example, where they have already developed models, the expectation is that they'll be enforceable in about 2 years' time. So it seems to me not impossible that you could get something through faster and get it done, but I think that would be unusual. So again, I'm not saying that we should give up on that or anything. I think it's probably worth figuring out like what would be the highest priority couple of things to do and sort of making the case for that. So I put the link in the chat there because, folks should share their opinions, right? And if you have a sense of what you would prioritize for people's efforts, it's worth communicating. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
So sort of given the realism of that timeline, and the fact that a lot of us on this is a League of Women Voters Zoom, and a lot of us here are deeply involved with the League or other organizations that work to protect democracy. What are ways that us as, we're not lawmakers, but like us as public organizations that work on voter education and things like that, what are ways that we can do to prepare for potential effects in the 2024 election? Are there sort of strategies that you might name?
That's a really good question. That's a great question. I'm going to put something else in the chat for you. I don't think I have an answer to that question yet, but I think I'm going to share it with my research network because that was a really well put question. And I think a thing that we would find helpful is, how to put it exactly. what I think I saw one question in the chat. Somebody said you're a local election administrator, and the question was, what should I as a local election administrator be thinking about? Collecting questions like that would be really helpful to researchers in the AI space, because I think if we could target, some of our efforts around questions of that kind, we could probably help with some answers. So, if you had thoughts about how to surface the kinds of questions that already feel pressing from where you sit in the work you're trying to do, and sort of share that catalog, I know I would find it helpful, and my colleagues would as well. I've put another link in the chat, which is a sort of another project to surface perspective and priorities in a sort of more democratic fashion. In this case, the organization called the Collective Intelligence Project is using AI to pull public opinion into decision-making by the labs. So that's another way in which people can learn more and participate more in the conversation. But again, I think having you collect and share with us questions would be really helpful. And we would do our best to get back to you with some draft answers for consideration and discussion.
No, that's great. I know the League of Women Voters of Maine, we're like just starting to really think about our engagement work ahead of the November 2023 election. So we haven't yet quite thought about 2024. But as soon as 2023 is over, I think there'll be a lot of questions and concerns about how our organization can help make sure that 2024 and other future elections go smoothly, even in this sort of changed landscape that we have.
Yeah.
So thank you. And then, sort of back a little bit to the regulatory part of this, someone is interested to hear your thoughts on how Homeland Security would build guardrails, or sort of what you envision when you talked about that.
Sure. Well, so it is, first of all, this sort of matter of establishing hazard tiers. And so various researchers have been working on doing this, like how do you identify the kinds of models that are highest risk and so forth. And having stable definitions of those is really important. And then, any inside the labs, they are actually really working on improving their own evaluation of what they're building. And they sort of evaluate, there's sort of like 4 different moments that get evaluated. It's sort of how you train the data and what kind of data you're using in training, or how you train the model rather, what kind of data you're using, how you decide on whether something can be deployed, or, how it itself needs to be fine-tuned before its deployment, so that its capabilities stay aligned with the kind of ethics parameters the company's trying to put on it. Then actual evaluation of how deployment goes. And then the question of like sort of security, how do you actually maintain security around models and the folks who are kind of developing them. And there need to be sort of standards set for all of those things. And so that hasn't been done yet. The companies are developing some kind of internal best practices, but it would be important to have an independent review of those best practices and like confirmation, yes, that's an adequate standard, or no, like that's, you're going too easy on yourselves. We need to ratchet the standard up to this other level. And then you would need to have the agency, again, if it's Homeland Security, actually monitoring, in particular, the frontier labs for the performance, in the same way that, we have, other kind of categories of work. The Department of Energy monitors Los Alamos. It monitors the sort of Fermi lab and things like that regularly for the kinds of categories that apply to safety when you're doing energy related work, for instance. So it's the sort of same kind of model as that for frontier AI labs. And then you'd have sort of down the food chain of hazard risk at like the very, very most basic non-risky level, you should like just leave that to industry and, encourage the setup of a kind of industry supported board of validation, right? Like best housekeeping seal. These apps meet, various kind of ethics standards if they get the best housekeeping seal. These other apps don't meet that. And you don't need to regulate in that sort of space at the bottom of the hazard tier.
That's a really helpful way to think about that. And so maybe we have time for one or two more questions. So we'll take this one from the chat. What or who at the United Nations is engaging into capabilities on sort of international governance? And I don't know, I haven't personally heard anything, but I also might have missed something. So I'm curious if there is work being done around like international collaboration on regulating AI.
Yeah, there is certainly international collaboration. The UN's not really at the front of it. The bodies that are working, so it is EU bodies basically are doing a much better job of trying to build out international collaboration and international governance. We need the State Department directly involved in all of this, because at the end of the day, we would have the job of like, once we have clarity on what kind of regulatory framework we want in this country, we actually kind of have to try to achieve it worldwide, because it will only work if it's global. So that's hard. And for example, the United Arab Emirates already, like public sector, built a model, et cetera, and released it open access, right? So like it's the UAE and Meta that have done that. And so, how do you actually secure the treaties that you need? I think that's more likely to be driven by the US and key allies, honestly, than by the UN. Because like very serious questions of power are at stake. And so I don't think the UN has the capacity to pull that off right now.
Interesting. Okay, I think we can take this last question too that just came in. How easy is it to fake AI? In other words, how easy is it to pass off models as AI when they're really not, and potentially controlled by bad actors, or maybe it doesn't work that way?
Yeah, I think it doesn't work that way. It's an interesting question. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it that way. I would encourage you to get a kind of intuitive sense about AI. You can get a subscription to ChatGPT-4 for just $20 a month. And it's worth doing just to play around and actually kind of get a feel for how it works. So maybe I'll use my last couple of minutes just to give you a couple of examples. And I will say too, I mean, ChatGPT, for all that it's extraordinary, like they really reduced its capabilities before they released it. It's like the actual stuff they have the capability for now, like far exceeds what's actually been released. Okay, it's like really important to understand that. But so ChatGPT, so I'll just share some things I've done, and then some ways like I've tried to find its own limits and its kind of glitches and stuff like that. So I had a research project that I was working on. I was trying to like answer some questions about how all 50 states handle a set of election law related questions, sort of the legal parameters. It's a real bear to kind of do that, because every state publishes their information in different ways. Nobody has it transparent and stuff like that. I'd been like working on it for 9 months. I would just work on it every so often because it was driving me crazy and it was so hard. So I was like, let me see if like ChatGPT can make this easier. So I put my questions in, and of course it had an instant answer. It was half wrong. 50% of it was wrong. Because I knew enough already to be able to see that 50% of it was wrong. So then I said, well, you've got this list of things wrong. And it said, oh, I'm sorry. Let me do that again. It came back with another answer, which was better. And so we sort of went through over time until it had an answer that I thought, as best as I can tell, looked pretty accurate. And so then I went and cross-checked it to see if the parts it was adding to my understanding were correct. And they were. So it did actually get to the correct answer. I had to fact check it, but it got there. And we did that together in a weekend when I had been working on it for 9 months, right? So that gives you a sense of the kind of how it accelerates anything that involves information, et cetera. In terms of its glitches, okay, here's my favorite one. So the version they didn't release, if you asked it, how can I recruit somebody to join Al-Qaeda, would give you good advice on how to recruit somebody into Al-Qaeda. And so they changed its instructions so that now if you say, how can I recruit somebody into Al-Qaeda? It will say Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization. I cannot give you advice on how to recruit somebody into a terrorist organization. Sorry, folks. Okay, that's the Al-Qaeda answer. So I said, well, please, ChatGPT, tell me how I could recruit somebody to the Weather Underground. And so it said, the Weather Underground is a terrorist organization. I'm sorry, I can't give you information on how to recruit somebody to the Weather Underground. Then I said, okay, tell me, ChatGPT, how to recruit somebody into the Underground Railroad. And ChatGPT said, the Underground Railroad is a historical organization, so I can't help you recruit people into the Underground Railroad, but also trafficking human beings across state lines is illegal and you shouldn't do it. Okay, so like it got that one really wrong, right? But so that gives you sort of a sense of the way in which they're trying to put kind of ethical guardrails in, but they can't actually, because there's like an infinity of things that can generate a need for ethical discrimination. And it is not actually possible to design that into an algorithm. So at any rate, there are like real limits. And you can see the gaps between it and human judgments and so forth in that kind of thing. But anyway, that's just one example.
Yeah. And I really sort of appreciate your suggestion that we all sort of familiarize ourselves with the technology, because I do think there's this maybe sense that it's like foreign or alien or intimidating. And we need to get over that if we ourselves are going to be good advocates for using it in ways that are pro-democratic and advocates for regulation that would set up safeguards. So I think that that's a good, maybe my takeaway now after this is that I'm going to go like investigate this, whereas I haven't yet. So anyway, thank you so much. I think we're sort of at time here, but thank you so much. Really appreciate this conversation. It was really interesting. And we'll have the recording up on our website soon. We'll have another conversation in July. We don't have that up on the events calendar yet, but I think it'll be about TikTok. So if you're interested in that social media platform or just don't really know anything about it, come join us. And thanks again, Dr. Allen, for your time and your expertise.
My pleasure. It was nice talking with all of you. Thanks for sponsoring the conversation.
Thank you.